Each year on the fourth Thursday of November, to become our American tradition, we have what we call Thanksgiving Day. And for years we would identify ourselves with the image of the family feast. I remember seeing pictures of the Rockwell paintings that you have also. The family feast, and it would include a turkey and yams and sage dressing and pumpkin pie. And people joke about how fat they're getting, still do. And when I was in school, we had pictures on the wall of pilgrims. They all wore little black caps and white shirts and so on. And so we all had the pilgrims dressed in black and white. Why? I'm sure they wore other colors too, but our pilgrims in our school wore black and white. And we were told by our teachers and our parents and in our churches and even on TV that the pilgrims came to America under the guidance of Providence. Of course, you don't hear those things from your teachers, unless it's homeschool, of course. You don't hear those things from your churches for the most part any longer. Certainly don't hear on TV. And you don't hear even parents too much knowledgeable enough to really explain to their children that God brought those pilgrim forefathers here. It was Providence. Now, America was established as a white Christian homeland, and we were grateful for the blessings God has given us. We knew America was ours. Our pilgrim forefathers came here in that tiny little rickety ship, about 90 feet long. Living quarters was on the second deck. And I know we sometimes think that the pilgrims were kind of had free reign of the ship, but that's not the case. They're pretty well confined for the 10 weeks of the travel to the second deck. There's 102 of them, and the second deck was about, the living quarters for the pilgrims was about 80 feet by about 20 feet. And they stringed like curtains or whatever they could on ropes, kind of make a little division between the various families. Ceiling was about 5 foot tall. And but they didn't have free run of the ship because there was also the crewmen, about 30 crewmen, and they didn't want a bunch of gawking sightseers in their way. You know, let's face it, they had a ship to maintain and get safely across the Atlantic. And so unless it was a very calm weather, only a few were allowed up, maybe up top. But for the most part, they were kept down below as much as possible because, again, the crew had work to do. They had the safety of the ship to take care of. So they didn't want a bunch of pilgrims in their way. And the pilgrims knew, records show that pilgrims believed that they had a covenant with God and that they were going to a new land, a promised land that God had provided for them. And although they had quite a bit of suffering, as you know, on that first winter, I know you heard the stories there in Plymouth County. The county began to grow and exploded very quickly. And within 13, of course, now we know Jamestown was settled 13 years earlier, Jamestown, Virginia. But it was Plymouth County that somehow captured the idea or the spirit of what America was all about. And an early American poet, author, James Russell Lowell, he said, quote, next to the fugitives whom Moses led out of Egypt, the little shipload of outcasts who landed at Plymouth are destined to influence the future of the world. And they certainly did. Nathaniel Morton, who was the nephew of the Governor Bradford, he wrote the very first history book, kind of history of the Pilgrims, called the New England Memorial, published in 1669. And he said that America was God's holy habitation. this is how they looked upon this nation. This is how they looked upon it. This is what they felt it was. Now, the Mayflower itself, a lot of you know this story, but it doesn't hurt for us to be reminded. The Mayflower itself originally was going to travel with another ship called the Speedwell. And the two ships were going to come across the Atlantic. And they were going to leave about mid-July. And they were going to meet up with the Speedwell on July 22. And the two ships, and they're going to begin their journey across the Atlantic to America. However, a leak was found very soon in the Speedwell, and it had to be repaired. So that got delayed, their departure. Around August 5th, the ship was repaired, and the Mayflower, the Speedwell, began the second time, and another leak was discovered in the Speedwell, and they had to repair it. After it was repaired, they began the third time to begin, and they got about 200 miles off the shores of England, and a third leak was discovered in the Speedwell. Now, Bradford believes, he wrote that he believes that it was sabotage, that members of the crew didn't just want to travel across to America. That's what he felt for 3 leaks to occur in the same ship in such a short period of time. But, of course, that was never proven. So now it's late September, September 16th. Actually, by this time, they were already supposed to be in America. Remember, they're going to leave in July, mid-July, a 2-month journey. They should have been already in America by middle September. And here they were still in England, haven't left yet. The Speedwell was abandoned, considered unworthy to travel, so most of the passengers remained, but 20 of them got on board with the already overcrowded Mayflower. And then William Bradford said, then they waited for the winds to be ready to begin their journey. They waited 7 days until finally the winds were enough to begin moving the sails and moving the ships and begin to travel. Bradford wrote, "We lie here waiting for as fair wind as can blow. Our victuals will be half eaten up." Now remember, they carried enough food for the travel to America, then for a little bit, but now they've been already living in the ship for 2 months. They've already been living there for 2 months in the ship, eating the food that they had provided. And he says that our victuals are about gone, about eaten up. I think before we go from the coast of England, and if our voyage lasts long, we shall not have a month's victuals when we come to the country. They're in dire situation. And again, leaving in July and that 2-month journey and that cramped quarters was bad enough, but consider they were frustrated, I'm sure, living in those cramped quarters of the Mayflower already for 2 months, eating up their food supply and waiting to travel. But finally, on September 16th, they did begin their journey to America and arrived, we know, mid-November. The Mayflower was considered a small cargo ship. It was not considered an ocean vessel. It was primarily built to carry merchandise, and it was used mostly for carrying clothing and wine back and forth from England to France. And it was built in 1608, so by 1620 it was already kind of an old ship, not built for ocean travel. And 4 years after the voyage to America, the ship was sold for scrap because it was considered no longer seaworthy. The Pilgrims were not just settlers, we have to understand. The Pilgrims represent a church. This was a church that came across the Atlantic, a small, tiny, separatist church with a pastor, and they made it travel. There was not a bunch of settlers going there. Now they did have contracts with some of the financiers to help produce, I believe, animal skins and things like that. So they were going to go there and try to pay back the investors of the ship. But primarily it was still a church that traveled to America. They were not settlers. a small separatist church. And they felt they were under the will and the grace of God. They thoroughly believed that the sunlight of heaven was upon them, and even in their hardships, they just knew it was for God. They understood that no hardship was something to curse God for. They believed that even in their hardships, it was a blessing to God because it made them stronger. And they believed God was their guide, and they were grateful for his guidance. And they referred to God in the term of, we hear, providence. Providence just simply means a provider, someone watches over you. So they referred to so often God as providence. Mid-ocean, the ship, made babe across the ship, cracked during a storm. The ship was rendered almost disabled. They weren't sure what to do. They anticipated going back to England. Hopefully they could make it. But one person said that by luck, he said by a stroke of luck, historian said, that one of the colonists had brought a metal screw jack, and they propped it up underneath the beam and screwed that like a house jack and pushed that beam up in place, held it secure. And they said it was by luck, but maybe it wasn't luck, maybe it was providence. And then there's a fellow, John Holland. He got swept overboard during the course of the storm, and he probably thought he was a goner. I would suspect that. But a crewman threw a rope out to him, and by providence, the rope was guided to his hand. And he grabbed the rope and was able to be pulled back to safety. He lived for many years. I think he became a secretary years later for the governor of Plymouth Colony. But they also carried other things with them. They carried tools with them. Obviously, they could go set up a home. They need some tools. And so they carried some tools. They carried food in those cramped little quarters. They carried some weapons. And they also carried some livestock. They carried some dogs, some sheep, and goats, and poultry, probably chickens, maybe turkeys, I don't know, but poultry. And maybe carry guinea hens too, I don't know, but probably chickens. At that time, in those days, there was no such thing as a passenger ship. So it wasn't like these were considered passengers on a cruise. Some of us have been on cruises, so it wasn't anything like that. They weren't passengers. They were cargo. It was a cargo ship, and the Pilgrims were pretty much just considered cargo that they were carrying from England to America. They were just cargo. And they stayed the second deck where the cargo was at, or the third deck where the cargo was at. And like I said, occasionally in calm weather, maybe a few could come up, but for the most part, the crew wanted them out of their way. And you can understand because there were ropes going around and the sails, all that stuff. It was a lot of activity on those ships, keeping it safe. And they traveled this way for 10 weeks and confined pretty much to the lower deck. It's dark. They didn't have kerosene lights. I don't know if they had any type of oil lights or not. I suspect they may have had a few, but I really don't know. It could be kind of dangerous having something like that in a ship. And so it was very dark. And but arriving at the shoreline of America, William Bradford, who became the second governor of Plymouth County, he said, being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought to safe land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth. And I'm sure they were glad to get there. I know I would have been. I rode on some of you have done the same thing. My mom and dad took Nero and I on a cruise a couple times, and those are big ships, huge ships compared to little Mayflower. And even those big ships, they get rocking in the waves of the ocean. So I'm sure that little Mayflower was rocking a lot. And probably you wonder every moment whether you're going to sink to the bottom of the ocean. Actually, there was a second Mayflower that was named the Mayflower a few years later, and it made numerous trips back and forth for America and England, but I think it was in 1640 or 1645, somewhere in there, with 140 passengers. It left England, but never arrived in America. So most likely it got sunk, obviously, in the bottom of the ocean. This is 1620, of course, when the Plymouth Colony was established. In 1629, Massachusetts Bay Colony was established, and people established settlements very quickly in what became Connecticut, Rhode Island, and by 1632 or 36 rather, which is like 15 years after Plymouth Colony, there's already other colonies spreading out across America. By 1640, just 20 years after the Pilgrims arrived, there's over 25,000 people living in New England. Many began moving into what became Vermont, and New Hampshire, and Maine, and New York, and Pennsylvania. So, on this Thanksgiving Day, I guess one of the things we'd be thankful for is for the faithfulness of our Pilgrim and Puritan forefathers. We'd be thankful for their faithfulness. God bless the Pilgrims and the early settlers, not because they had the right church doctrines, but because they were his people. They believed they were under the guiding hand of Providence. In moving ahead a few years, December 16, 1773, we had occurred in Boston uprising. A bunch of colonists dressed up like Indians, and they threw thousands of dollars worth of tea into the ocean, and it was called the Boston Tea Party, as you know. In retaliation to that, England passed the Massachusetts Governor Act in May of 1774, which is a few years after that. They passed the Massachusetts Government Act in retaliation to the Boston Tea Party. The act removed the basic structure of colonial government as guaranteed by the 1691 Charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The colonists responded by themselves and by creating the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and calling for local militias to train for possible hostilities. It was in 1774. They are aware that hostilities in England was perhaps afoot. And so they organized this provisional government, Massachusetts Provisional Congress, in order to instruct the settlements in town to organize their militias. This colonial government effectively controlled the colony. Even though it was under English, it was an English colony, England pretty much only controlled Boston. That's where they had their troops at. And they had controlled Boston since 1768. They controlled Boston, but all the rest of the colony came under control of the colonists. And when they did that, when they passed that provision, the British then responded by declaring Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. It was this declaration of looked upon as war against the colonies that inspired Patrick Henry. Just a few months later, in March of 1775, gave what has been called his liberty or death speech, in which he said, our brethren are already in the field, why stand we here idle? Henry's speech to the House of Burgesses who gathered there convinced them of the need to organize the Virginia militia and offer assistance to Massachusetts, which they did. The call of the colonial government for the mustering of the militia is what caused General Thomas Gage to set his sights on Concord. Rumors were about that Concord had gathered vast supply of weapons and gunpowder and were prepared. And because of those rumors, he felt the need to somehow confiscate those items. And General Gage is an interesting person because he was a loyal British soldier, but he had been living in the United States, America rather, at that time, for 18 years. He was personal friends with George Washington. They served together in the French and Indian War. Over those 18 years, he had made many, many, many friends of Americans, and even purchased 19,000 acres in upstate New York. And so he had many, many connections in America, but still a British soldier. But the most interesting connection was he married an American girl named Margaret Kimball. And she was the daughter of one of the most prominent families in New Jersey. And she was his wife, of course. But the interesting thing is she never hid the fact that she suffered in her, I'm using that word, she did not, divided loyalties. And because she had felt a loyalty to her husband, but she also felt an immense loyalty to America, her homeland. And she said, quote, she hoped her husband would never be the instrument of sacrificing the lives of her countrymen. So they had all these weapons and gunpowder at Concord, and General Gage was going to confiscate them. And the British regulars were sent there to Concord on the night of the 18th of April to confiscate what they thought would be an easy mission. They really thought it was going to be an easy thing to do. All these soldiers, 700 soldiers, going to march into Concord, confiscate the stuff, and move on their way. And but they were quite surprised, for somehow there was the colonists and the Minutemen, the militia and the Minutemen, were there at Concord or at Lexington, and they were shocked and surprised. How do they know we were coming? How did they get here? Just the plans were developed that night. The night of the 18th is when they begin. When Gage sent his soldiers to Concord, nobody knew. Nobody knew, and it was a last-minute announcement to what their mission was. The captain of the militia was a fellow by the name of John Parker, and John Parker, he had tuberculosis, and he literally crawled out of his deathbed, so to speak, to go to the battle in Lexington, or join his men in Lexington. He could hardly speak, he could hardly breathe, he could hardly talk, could only talk in a whisper. And he whispered his commands to his subordinates, who would then relay them to the drums and the fife. And because he was so ill, and he actually died just a few months later from tuberculosis. So all the soldiers there, militia, the Minutemen, are there at Lexington, and that morning, 700 regulars from Gage's troops came onto the field green there in Lexington, and they're surprised. Major John McCarran was the leader of the British regulars. He commanded, they put down your weapons, you rebels, put down your weapons. They didn't do that. And how did they find out? How did they get it turned out that the Joseph Warren, who was kind of it's unfortunate he died, he was killed in Battle of Bunker Hill just 2 months later, because he was quite a organizer, a propagandist, if I use that phrase. He had men already, because they were aware stuff was going to go on. They were aware of it. Joseph Warren had intelligence informing him of what was going on, and he had Paul Revere and 2 other men, and already ready to go whenever they got the signal into what was called alarm and muster. I'm not quite sure what that means, but they knew what it meant, and it had been carefully developed, this technique of warning the countryside, alarm and muster, months before. I understand that whatever it was, they actually used it during the French and Indian War to warn villages and so on, but it kind of got a disuse when peace came. But they revived it again, whatever it was. I don't know, maybe somebody could find out what alarm and muster was back in the colonial period. But When Joseph Warren got the message, he sent forth the riders that they warned the colonists, the farm people, the townspeople, that the British were coming. Now, we hear quite often that Paul Revere shouted, "The British are coming, British are coming," but as I read a while back, he said he probably never said actually the British are coming because they themselves consider themselves British. The term used mostly was regulars, the redcoats, so the regulars were coming. But who knows? And but the question remains: how did Joseph Warren? How did Joseph Warren get this information so quickly? So quickly. I mean, within hours after Gage began, Joseph Warren had the information and sent forth his couriers to warn the people. General Gage said that he only told 2 people of his plans, only 2 people. One was his immediate subordinate, and he said one other person. But he never identified who the other person was. I told 2 people, so-and-so and one other person, but he never identified who the other person was, and it had been long suspicious that the other person was Margaret Kimball, his wife, who had divided loyalties. She loved her husband, but she loved her country. And she was also good friends with Joseph Warren, and she is suspected that she notified Joseph Warren of the plans to confiscate the weapons and the gunpowder at Concord. The skirmish at Lexington was over very quickly, and people usually say the British won that particular skirmish. And then the British begin heading towards Concord, and that's where the troubles really began for them. The confiscation of the weapons was considered to be it was going to be like an easy task. And the British were not prepared. They had neither the manpower or the firepower to repel a massive, not rebellion, but reaction, I guess, from the Patriots and engage them in conflict. And so very soon, the British were in a rout because they were being ambushed from every side. And the biggest conflict occurred at what we call the North Bridge, went over the Concord River, where the regulars were put to retreat. Over 400 Patriots attacked about 90 British regulars at the North Bridge. And lacking effective leadership and terrified and spirited numbers of the enemy, the British broke and ran and fled to Charleston. We sometimes fail to understand the nature of our people is to keep records. They've got the blueprints for the aqueducts in ancient Rome. They've discovered and unearthed and so on. All the blueprints. So we are people that keep records. It was no different then. After the Battle of Lexington, you say, well, how do they know this? How do they know that? How do they know that happened? Well, it's very simple. Joseph Warren, after the Battle of Lexington, gathered the Committee of Safety, and they begin interviewing witnesses. Witnesses who saw the fighting, interviewed them. They brought in justices of the peace. They brought in notary publics who took sworn testimony. And so all these things were documented. They took all the sworn testimony out, and they even took sworn testimony from the captured British soldiers. So they detailed exactly what happened there at the battle. The only question they never did figure out was who fired the first shot. You know, you all hear that about the shot heard around the world. Nobody's been able to determine who did that. Has been accused be the British, some militiamen, somebody from a wall, somebody from some other location. And so the no better example, I guess, I think is kind of humorous, can be seen what the British were up against is an incident that happened with General Gage shortly before the conflict began. His second in command was a fellow by the name General Frederick Haldeman. And General Haldeman one morning had a bunch of kids at a doorstep. And they're angry, these colonial kids. They're angry. And Haldeman, what's going on, kids? Little children, what's going on? This is before the fighting got started, before Battle of Concord. It was just an incident happened. And they're angry because the hill right outside of the headquarters of Gage, evidently they had put dumped some wood ashes out there, and the kids were mad because they used that hill for sliding their sleds. And they told, at the steps of Haldeman, as he came to the door with their anger, they said, "Our fathers had coasted on that hill since the founding of the colony, and they demanded the damage be repaired immediately." Well, Haldeman was good-humored about it, so he ordered the repair of the sliding hill. And he related that in kind of a humorous way to General Gage. And General Gage's reaction was mournful, and he said, "It is impossible to beat the notion of liberty out of these people. It is rooted in them from their childhood." I said, even these kids know there's a certain thing of liberty. And he said it could be impossible to root it out of them. One British loyalist said the pulpits were converted into gutters of sedition. In 1843, Levi Preston, a 91-year-old veteran of America's War for Independence, was asked, he said, "What made you go fight?" His answer, "Young man, what we meant in going for those redcoats was this: we had always governed ourselves, and we always meant to." Israel Putnam, one of the commanders of Bunker Hill, said, "We know what we are contending for. We will set our country an example of which it shall not be ashamed, and show those who seek to oppress us what we men can do who are determined to live free or not live at all." As the Battle of Bunker Hill was about to be engaged, General Gage called one of his American assistants, who was a loyalist, because there were many Americans who were loyalists to the king. His name was Abijah Willard. Gage, looking through his field glasses, handed them over to Willard and said, do you recognize that tall man on the parapet?" Willard, the American loyalist, took the field glasses, looked through them, and said, "Yes, it's Colonel William Prescott. He's my brother-in-law." Gage asked him, "Will he fight?" Willard replied, "I cannot answer for his men, but he will fight you to the gates of hell." The reputation of Prescott as a fighter may go back a few years earlier, because during the siege of Louisbourg, during the French-Indian War, the epidemic went through the camp. William Prescott, who later would be at Bunker Hill, got ill, and it was feared that he was at the point of death. The regiment doctor came in, and Prescott laying there in his bed, and the regimental doctor came in, looked at him, and simply declared there's nothing anyone could do for him. Well, upon hearing those words, William Prescott became very angry. It said he leaped out of his bed, grabbed a sword, and chased the doctor out of the tent, and soon recovered. There's a letter found a few years after the war, American Revolution. It was a part of a correspondence between a young man and his mother. And the mother had said in a letter to her son, she said, "Every day I pray that you will return home safely." And the letter they found was from the son to the mother. And he said, please don't pray that I come home safely. Pray I have the courage to do my duty. So I'm thankful for our Pilgrims' forefathers for their faithfulness. And I'm thankful for the faithfulness who fought to obtain our liberties. But what has happened to the faithfulness, the faith of our forefathers? What happened to the faith of the Pilgrims? What happened to the faith of our founding fathers? What happened to the faith of those who passed through the Cumberland Gap into Tennessee and Kentucky? What happened to the faith of the early pioneers? What happened to the faith of those who blazed across the Oregon Trail? What happened to those who built sod homes in the grasslands of Kansas and Oklahoma, Nebraska? What happened to the faith of those who buried their loved ones along the trails to the west? What happened to their faith? Where did it go? We look at our country today and we look what has happened. Look at the betrayal. And those who don't even think they were betrayed by their actions, but the lack of caring, lack of concern, just don't care. So I'm thankful for all those things, but I'm also thankful that though we will be judged harshly by God, our nation will be judged harshly. We have the promise that he'll forgive us and have mercy on us. I'm thankful for their faith. I'm thankful for the faithfulness of God. Isaiah 49:13 says, "Sing, O heavens, and be joyful, O earth, and break forth into singing, O mountains, for the Lord has comforted his people, and will have mercy upon his afflicted." In 1778, I'm going to close with this. In 1778, William Billings, who was a well-known composer at that time, wrote a song that became very popular. The first verse goes like this, and this is my closing comments. He said, "Let tyrants shake their iron rod, and slavery clank her galling chains. We fear them not, we trust in God. New England's God forever reigns." We are thankful that we have a God that forever reigns. Let's pray. Our Father, we are thankful for, indeed, for all those men, women who paid such dear price to give us this land we have called America. We know the names of Washington and Jefferson and Patrick Henry, but there's thousands and thousands of names that only you know, who gave their lives and sacrificed their blood and their freedoms for this country and for our future. We wonder what has happened. What has happened to their children? How come they betrayed the calling our forefathers passed to them? Father, we're thankful for all the mercy you've given upon us, all the mercy we know that we'll still be able to claim. We know that you have not forsaken our people, you have not forsaken us, and though we find the country in disarray, and we know that you will judge this country harshly, we will not expect anything else. We pray your mercy upon us and our children. In your name, we ask it.